Okay, hello chess players. Today we're going to be going over the Ruy Lopez after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5 begins the Ruy Lopez, and we're going to be going over a variation after a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castles. We're going to have b5, bishop b3, bishop e7, rook e1, d6, c3, castles, h3, and we're going to be looking at this sort of weird looking move, which I'm not sure what the name of it is, but I guess it's just the Carey's variation. It goes knight d7 here. And of course, white should continue with pawn to d4, and we're going to talk about some of the ideas after this. So anyways, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So anyways, when we're trying to figure out what the concept behind a move is, we need to look at what squares the knight might be going to, and what squares and possibilities this leaves open and leaves uncovered. So one of the things that knight d7 might be aimed at is it might be aimed at being able to meet a move like d5 with a move like f5. Like, let's say, for example, after d4, black were to play something like knight to b6, and let's just say that your normal thing that you do in the Ruy Lopez is you like to close things off with d5. Well, in this case, it might not be advisable to play f5, because black might be able to play something like knight a5, bishop c2, and then immediately counter with f5. As a matter of fact, the engine really likes just immediately countering with f5. I found a couple games on the database where people countered with c6 right here, and the engine doesn't dislike that move either. But basically, just being able to target this pawn chain with both c6 and f5, because now there is nothing in the way on the f6 square, and now f5 is an available move. So, for example, f5, e takes f5, bishop f5, rook f5, b3, queen f8, bishop e3, e4, knight d4, rook takes d5 would be unclear. And the engine actually gives this is pretty near equality. So that might be one of the ideas behind this move, knight d7, is being able to counter this d4, d5 with an eventual f5. Now, that being said, a lot of people do play this differently. A lot of people do like to plant their bishop on f6, and this was actually the preference of Karpov when he was playing against Kasparov. And as soon as they play bishop f6, if you want, you can of course just play this immediate d5. There's actually nothing wrong with this. As far as I can tell, if you play d5, for example, knight e7, a4 should be advantage white. Another possibility is they could play something like knight a5, and this actually happened in a game. This happened in Mirosevic versus Sacco, and after bishop to c2, knight to b6. Note that the bishop is in the way now, f5 is not possible, therefore this position should be advantage white as well. Now, in the Mirosevic versus Sacco game, Mirosevic continued with pawn to a4. It is also possible to be very direct, just play something like b4, knight c4, and then a4. This should also be major advantage white. But Mirosevic was a little bit more clever. He played a4 first, and then after bishop d7, he took advantage of the fact that the knight could no longer go to the d7 square, and then played b4. And after knight b7, played a5, and then after knight c8, of course, had a huge advantage because black just can't get any of his pieces out in any meaningful way. And this position is already just nearly winning for white. He continued with c4, knight to b7, we had knight to c3, and as you can see, white's position is gorgeous, and all of black's pieces are incredibly awkward, and the engine just gives this decisive advantage white. So this was Mirosevic versus Sacco, played in Spain back in 2007. So, like I said, d5 is a possibility, and honestly, I don't know why you wouldn't do it. But it is worthy to note that when Kasparov was faced with this, Kasparov preferred the move a4. This was Kasparov versus Karpov, which continued a4, and then we had bishop to b7, and then we had knight a3. And again, I think d5 is better. And I think if you're preparing this, I think at this point there's definitely no reason not to play d5. Because when I plugged this on the engine, I couldn't even figure out why after d5, let's just say knight e7, ab5, rook a8, queen a8, knight a3 wasn't just completely winning. And not only did the engine agree, I found two games in this line. I found Adams versus Haslinger, and I found Dominguez versus Fiedler. And in both games, white got a completely winning position. Now, in the Dominguez versus Fiedler game, Fiedler did manage to get a draw, but when going over the game with the engine, it doesn't seem like there was any reason that Fiedler should have gotten a draw. It seems like he just managed to squeak out with a draw, even though at several points during the game, the engine gave white as much as a +4 advantage. The whole reason is that b5 pawn is very hard to hold. So, for example, bishop a6, knight h2, knight g6, knight to g4, and we're actually still following both games, by the way. Bishop e7, knight to e3, rook to b8, knight on e to c2, knight c5, knight b4, bishop to c8, and then this knight comes to c6. Now, they both tried slightly different stuff. One of the games continued with rook to b7, and then after bishop to c2, white had a decisive advantage and eventually went on to win. This was Adams versus Haslinger, played in 2003. You can see the rook almost doesn't have anywhere to go already. It's kind of a sad position. But then the other game continued, rook b6, which maybe was a little better. This was Dominguez versus Fiddler, but it still ended up with a pretty similar problem. Just bishop c2, bishop d7, b4, knight back to b7, bishop e3, and black had to sacrifice his exchange. And there wasn't enough compensation for it. After bishop to c1, black is down a clear exchange. There's not enough compensation. White should just have a major to decisive advantage in this position as well. Now, all that being said, going back to this critical position after bishop b7, Kasparov's preference was to play knight a3. And again, I can't emphasize this enough, I really feel like d5 is better because Karpov had a lot of counterplay after e captures d4, c captures d4. Suddenly the knight on c6 and the bishop on f6 make a lot of sense. They're targeting the pawn on the d4 square. That's going to be something that White's going to have to defend and deal with for the rest of the game. But Kasparov did manage to go on to win. After knight b6, he played bishop to f4, and after b takes a4, bishop a4, knight takes a4, queen takes a4, we had a5. And here we had bishop d2, rook e8, and then d5. And finally, now that White has played d5, apparently this position is now slight edge White. Not major or decisive advantage White, by the way, but slight edge White. And again, that's why I feel like d5 probably should have been played earlier. I don't feel like we need to repeat this Kasparov-Karpov game, even though it was a pretty cool game. And Kasparov did eventually win, in their World Championship match in 1990. Kasparov did eventually win with the white pieces. I don't feel like for theoretical purposes or for preparation purposes, this is something that necessarily needs to be repeated because White's advantage here is actually kind of minimal. But Kasparov was able to eventually beat Karpov from this position. So, sort of in conclusion, going back to d4, we have these two different possibilities here. We don't want to play d5 against knight to b6, but against bishop f6, d5 is, of course, acceptable. So the question is, what to do against knight to b6, and this is just kind of like the final part of this video. Now we have two great examples of what to play against knight to b6, because we know that d5 is probably a bit questionable. So the question is, if we can't play d5 here because of the inevitable f5, what move should we play other than d5? Well, there's two options. There's bishop to e3, which was favored by Tal in Tal versus Pano. And, of course, there's Fischer, who tried d captures e5, and this was Fischer versus Sanchez. So Fischer's idea was to just get like a minimal advantage in the normal way that he does, in the normal Ruy Lopez way. He wanted to play d takes e5, knight e5, knight e5 takes. He wanted to develop his queen to h5. After bishop f6, he just maneuvered his knight in the normal way, brought his queen to g3. After bishop h4, played queen f2, and then just developed his pieces very normally, and eventually got a very, very slight edge with white. And this is the critical part. He starts pushing this pawn in an effort to loosen up White's position further. And then once he manages to create some weaknesses on the light squares, he just continues to maneuver and maneuver into those light squared weaknesses and try to prove that Black has a set of bad pieces. So this is one way that we can play, and we can look and see how Fischer just kind of worked this position very slowly here, creating more bad pieces, more bad squares, and then slowly, positionally worked his pieces to slightly better squares over time. Eventually, Fischer was willing to exchange pieces. He was even willing to exchange queens, just because he knew that his pieces had superior placement. And then eventually he was able to push this pawn all the way to the point where Black's pieces are getting seriously tied down, and Black wasn't able to completely fix this problem. Now Black is getting pinned, Black is getting tied down, Black is running out of squares to put his pieces. Black finally does decide to break out of this mess by maneuvering his rook in a way to take advantage of the pin, just basically trying to free himself. He plays this move rook b6, trying to break free, but this leads to a different problem. We have this mate threat on the e7 square, and we have this big passed pawn on c7. And Fischer was eventually able to make this work with a cute little tactic that he played against the bishop. He played b4, and when his opponent played bishop takes b4, he played bishop d2. The point being that you can't move the bishop back because the knight on a5 hangs, but if you play bishop takes bishop, then rook e7 is mate. So d takes e5 is one way to handle it. Maybe the slightly better way to handle it is just to maintain the tension and play a move like bishop e3. And this is what Tal did against Pano, although I wouldn't necessarily go down the path that Tal went down. That game continued d takes c5, c takes d4, and then knight a5, bishop c2, and all this is fine. After c5, Tal continued with e5, and this led to wild Tal-like complications, which is pretty normal with Tal. And the computer gives it as equal, because computers are awesome and they're brave. But really what you should do is just play knight c3, and the computer gives this as major advantage white, so that should be your preparation. And to give you an idea of why you shouldn't go into the complications that Tal went into, after d5, here's what happened in the game. It went d takes c5, knight takes c5, knight to c4, and then we had queen d3. Now, according to the engine, g6 is just slight edge black, so already this is a big red flag for me. I don't want to do this. I think a lot of modern players are going to find g6. Now, in the game, f5 was played, and then we ended up going into these wild complications after bishop to b3, f4, bishop d2, knight b3, knight c6, and then a bunch of stuff got captured in exchange for black's queen, and we end up with this wild mess of a position where white has a queen, black has some pieces, a bunch of the pieces are on the black back rank. This is just like a normal Tal position, and Tal did go on to win with the white pieces, but the computer didn't think it was anything special. The computer just thought this was equal. It's, of course, an impossible position for any human being on the planet to calculate. But I wouldn't recommend against going down Tal's particular path here. I think bishop e3 was fine. The critical thing you have to remember is just after exchange, knight a5, bishop c2, c5, you just need to play knight c3 here, and that position should be major advantage white. Anyways, that is essentially how you need to meet the knight d7 move. You need to play d4. On any move like bishop f6 that blocks the f5 pawn, d5 as your immediate move should be your theory. It's the most solid move according to the engines and according to modern practice. And on a move like knight to b6, you should just hold your center with bishop e3, and just remember after takes, you don't need to go into these wild complications with e5. Knight c3 with major advantage for white is just fine. Anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess. I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.